It was supposed to be a quiet weekend at the lake for Daniel Walker, a fire, a book, and the kind of silence that fixes a week. Then came the pounding on the door. Margaret, Maggie, Hensley, the HOA's iron-fisted president, didn't knock. She stormed in, waving violations like weapons and threatening fines that could bleed a man dry. She thought she'd cornered another homeowner. What she didn't know was who sat at Daniel's table, listening to every word. The calm voice that finally cut through her tirade belonged to State Attorney General Robert Hallé. In a heartbeat, the power shifted. Rules, threats, control, all of it suddenly on trial. When someone tries to own your peace and your property, how far are you willing to go to take it back? From a distance, the lake cabin didn't look like the kind of place where battles were fought. Nestled beneath tall pines, with sunlight glinting off the water, it looked like peace carved into wood and stone. For Daniel Walker, it wasn't just a cabin, it was the dream he had worked for years to earn. Long hours at the firm, careful, saving and sacrifices most people never saw had finally bought him this retreat. Every Friday evening, he left behind the noise of the city and stepped into a life that felt like it was his again. Neighbors were few, but kind. Henry Caldwell, the retired veteran who waved from his porch each morning. Linda and Mark Jennings, a young family who loved fishing with their kids. And Eleanor Price, the quiet widow who tended flowers along her fence. It was a neighborhood where smiles were enough and words were rare. At least, until Maggie Hensley made her presence known. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was the HOA president, self-declared guardian of community standards. With her clipboard, her sharp eyes, and her rigid interpretation of the bylaws, Maggie wasn't remembered for friendliness. She was remembered for her rules. At first, Daniel thought he could avoid her notice. He kept his yard clean, paid his dues, and stayed polite. His canoe sat tight at the dock, his solar lanterns barely brighter than fireflies, his firewood neatly stacked. He assumed that would be enough. But for Maggie, rules weren't just guidelines, they were weapons. And newcomers like Daniel were easy targets. The first warning seemed small, a note about dock maintenance. Then a complaint about his lanterns being too bright. Neighbors whispered warnings when they passed. Watch out, Daniel. Maggie tests everyone. She pushes until you pay or give up. Daniel brushed it off at first. After all, how much trouble could one woman really cause over a cabin by the lake? What he didn't realize was that Maggie wasn't simply enforcing rules. She was testing her control, and Daniel Walker had just stepped directly into her sights, and fate had arranged a cruel twist. The very weekend Maggie decided to escalate her campaign against Daniel was the same weekend he had invited a quiet but powerful guest to his cabin. Attorney General Robert Hallé began with the sound of gravel crunching under tires. Daniel Walker had just finished stacking firewood when a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of his cabin. Out stepped Maggie Hensley, clipboard in hand, her lips pressed in the thin, satisfied line of someone who believed authority was on her side. She didn't wait for a greeting. She walked straight to Daniel's dock, bent down, and ran her pen across her paper. Violation: dock boards uneven. Violation: unauthorized solar fixtures. Violation: unapproved firewood structure. Daniel stood still, watching her scribble. Behind the cabin window, Attorney General Robert Hallé sipped coffee, unseen. The first fine arrived that Monday. $500 for unauthorized modifications to common property. Daniel read the letter twice, stunned. It wasn't just the money, it was the tone. It warned of further disciplinary action, including potential lien filings. Then came another. And another. Each week, Maggie escalated. One for excessive smoke from evening fire. Another for noise disturbances when Daniel hosted Henry Caldwell for fishing. A warning about his canoe's paint color, not in harmony with community standards. Neighbors began avoiding eye contact, whispering at the mailbox. Linda Jennings murmured once, almost apologetically, "She did this to us too." We paid, it's easier, but Daniel wasn't bending. He documented everything, photos, dates, even the absurd complaints. And every time Maggie appeared with her clipboard, he forced a polite smile, though his patience thinned with every Encounter. The tension grew sharper when Maggie called a special HOA meeting. Daniel attended, sitting in the back, arms crossed. Maggie stood at the front, lecturing about the need for strict compliance. She spoke as though the community were her personal kingdom. Some nodded in fear. Others kept their heads low. Daniel raised his hand once, asking calmly, "Where exactly in the bylaws is it prohibited to use solar lanterns?" Maggie's face tightened. She flipped papers but gave no answer. Instead, she shifted, accusing him of challenging community. Harmony. The room fell silent. The message was clear. She didn't need rules. She had power, but she underestimated Daniel's resolve. What Maggie didn't know was that her campaign wasn't just annoying anymore, it was building a case. And Robert Halley, still quietly observing, was keeping notes. By late summer, Maggie escalated again. She filed a notice that Daniel's property would be subject to a mandatory inspection. She arrived unannounced, marching across his yard with 2 board members in tow. Daniel stopped them at the steps. "Not without a warrant," he said, his voice steady. Maggie bristled, barking about community rights and board authority. Daniel didn't move. Behind him, Robert Halley stepped forward for the first time, his presence calm but commanding. He didn't introduce himself yet, just observed. That night, another letter arrived. This one was harsher, threatening legal action, foreclosure, and forced compliance. It wasn't just fines anymore. Maggie wanted to break him. The tension reached a breaking point one evening when Daniel returned from town to find a bright orange sign staked in his yard. "Property in violation under review." Neighbors slowed their cars, whispering. Children pointed. It was public humiliation, Maggie's favorite weapon. Daniel tore the sign out of the ground. His hands shook, not with fear, but with a cold determination. He knew this wasn't just about his cabin anymore. This was about a system of power built on intimidation. And Maggie was about to find out just how fragile that power could be, because the attorney general wasn't just watching anymore. He was preparing, and the storm Maggie had unleashed was about to circle back on her. Harder than she ever imagined. The morning of the annual HOA gathering dawned strangely still. A hush lingered over the lake as residents trickled toward the clubhouse. Rumors had already spread. Maggie Hensley was planning her ultimate strike against Daniel Walker. Inside, Maggie stood tall at the front, her clipboard replaced with a polished binder stamped with the HOA seal. Her voice rang with authority. As she declared, "Today, this board will vote to place a lien on Mr. Walker's property. He has violated standards beyond repair." Gasps rippled across the room. Daniel sat in the center row, his jaw clenched. He'd known this moment was coming, but he wasn't alone anymore. When Maggie called for the vote, Daniel rose. His voice was calm but carried across the hall. "Before this community decides, there's something you should all see." He lifted a folder from his bag and spread photos, letters, and timestamped documents on the table. Each one chronicled Maggie's harassment, contradictory fines, made-up rules, and even her public shaming tactics. He documented everything. The room buzzed as neighbors leaned closer, realizing just how far Maggie had gone. But before she could regain control, a deeper voice interrupted. Robert Halley stepped forward from the back, finally revealing his identity. His presence shifted the air instantly. The Attorney General wasn't a rumor anymore. He was here, standing inches away from Maggie's binder of so-called authority. "I've been observing this situation for some time," Halley said firmly. "And what I've witnessed is not enforcement of bylaws. It's targeted harassment, misuse of power, and potentially criminal behavior." Maggie's face drained of color. She stammered, insisting she was just upholding standards. But Halley opened his own file, state-level records of HOA complaints, her signature on multiple questionable fines, and even reports of funds being misused under her leadership. The neighbors erupted. Whispers turned to outrage. Henry Caldwell shook his head in disgust. Linda Jennings whispered, "We were too scared to fight her." The turning point came when Halley laid down the final piece, a state injunction halting any action against Daniel's property. Effective immediately, Maggie tried to shout over him, but her voice cracked. For the first time, the clipboard queen had lost control, and everyone saw it. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The weight of the room had shifted entirely. People who once feared Maggie now looked at her with anger, even pity. The curtain had been pulled back. When Halle finished, silence hung for a beat. Then the clubhouse erupted in applause. Neighbors clapped. Some even stood, relieved to see someone finally stand up against years of intimidation. Maggie, trembling, gathered her papers and stormed out, her heels striking the floor like retreating gunfire. But the echo of her departure didn't carry the same power it once did. It sounded like defeat. Daniel exhaled slowly. For months, the battle had drained him, but this was the moment everything shifted. The predator had been exposed. The community had seen the truth, and as the crowd settled, Robert Halle turned to Daniel and said quietly, "Now we begin holding her accountable." The storm had broken. But its impact was only just beginning to spread. The storm that had shaken the clubhouse didn't end with Maggie Hensley storming out, it only began there. Word spread across the lake community like wildfire. By nightfall, neighbors who once whispered about Maggie's control were openly discussing her downfall. Daniel Walker, the weight that had pressed on his shoulders for months, finally lifted. Walking along the lake that evening, he noticed something he hadn't seen in weeks. His neighbors smiling at him, waving, even stopping to apologize. Many admitted they'd stayed quiet out of fear, afraid of Maggie's wrath. But now, seeing her exposed, they realized silence had only given her more power. Within days, the HOA board called an emergency meeting, this time without Maggie at the helm. Henry Caldwell, usually the quiet observer, spoke up. He confessed to seeing things he never agreed with but lacked the courage to challenge. Linda Jennings admitted she'd been fined unfairly for years but never thought she could resist. Dozens of others came forward with their own stories. The Attorney General's office, led by Robert Halle, moved swiftly. An investigation was launched into Maggie's handling of HOA funds and her abuse of authority. The glossy image she had built as the protector of standards crumbled overnight. What once seemed like untouchable power was revealed as fragile manipulation, propped up by fear and intimidation. For Daniel, victory wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming his peace. He returned to his lake cabin, finally able to sit by the fire without checking for violation notices on his doorstep. He rebuilt what Maggie's harassment had almost destroyed: trust in his neighbors, comfort in his home, and the belief that standing up, even alone, was worth it. The broader community felt the ripple. New bylaws were adopted to ensure transparency. The board members voted unanimously to strip Maggie of her presidency and bar her from holding any HOA office again. Months later, Maggie's name was tied not to power, but to lawsuits and restitution. Residents no longer feared her. They pitied her. The same woman who once marched into homes demanding obedience now found herself facing hearings where her voice carried no weight, but the most powerful shift wasn't legal, it was personal. Neighbors began talking, helping, and even laughing together again. Where suspicion once lived, community grew. And it all traced back to one weekend, one confrontation, and one man refusing to be bullied. In his final conversation with Daniel before leaving the lake, Robert Halle left him with words that echoed long after. Bullies thrive in silence, but once the silence breaks, their power collapses. You did more than protect your cabin, Daniel. You gave this neighborhood back its voice. As the sun set across the calm waters, Daniel sat on his porch, watching the reflections ripple. Peace wasn't just the absence of conflict. It was the presence of justice. And for everyone who had endured Maggie's reign of control, the message was clear: power built on fear always falls. But the courage to stand up, that changes everything.
This was just one story, but the next one will be even more dramatic. Are you ready? Then you need to subscribe to HOA Stories 87 right now. Like this video, share it with your friends, and hit the bell because the next story might sound a little too close to home.